Thank you very much, Alan and Eugénia. That's uncanny timing.
Yes.
With 15 seconds, that's professionalism of a high order. Okay, so I think we'll take the opportunity of having some questions now. So just to remind people that there'll be filming still, so that if they have a reason they don't want to be filmed doing questions, that they should indicate that. And do you want to come to the front, and then you can sort of take questions with Alan. Now, because of Alan's travel arrangements, so we've only got half an hour at the most. So, I mean, we'll see how the questions go. But if you've got questions, get them up there early. Because, so smart.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, so I was just wondering. So I really like both talks, and I really like the relationships that you're talking about. And I've done some empirical work with some Zooniverse scientists. And out of all the different potentials and different sorts of relationships that you were talking about, I wondered, so often for Zooniverse citizen scientists, then they actually see contributing to science as part of their citizenship.
Yes.
And when you were talking as well about the trying to have barriers between citizenship and science, citizens and science, and how scientists might resist ideas of citizenship penetrating into science. Then also, as well, within these platforms, you see scientism penetrating into citizenship. So that flow can happen in the other direction too. So you see that notions of citizenship take on more scientistic sort of aspects in terms. So the push can be sort of in the other direction as well. So
yeah,
observations really welcome questions.
Do you want to?
Well, I mean, yes, and I guess what I'm trying to suggest is the notion of citizenship could be altered in that way, because whoever we is, has an idea of citizenship as being one thing and knowledge production being another, and this could precisely be unsettling. I guess that's what I find the interesting thing in citizen science. But I certainly take it from you that if people see it as an expression of citizenship. So one thing that was discussed in San Jose were weekends where people would do a kind of blitz of an area in the city, and check the bird life, the worms. I'm obsessed with worms now, the butterflies, etc. And I can imagine people coming up with that with us, like coming back from voting. You've taken the kids, the whole family's there. You kind of feel good about it. So there's something there which is sort of right and makes you feel better as a citizen. And I wouldn't take that away. I mean, it is also an expression of citizenship when people inform themselves of that way. And then my question would be, and would that develop further? Would that lead into a discussion of, why is it that we're seeing what we're seeing? Are we think there's that good situation or a bad situation? And where we go from there? Which of course is the point where the scientists, as the Nature editorial was also suggesting, would part company and say, no, we're only interested in the knowledge production aspect. Those bits we wish to filter out. Yeah.
Okay, so we have Robin, and then Steve, and then Jane. So I'll leave it to you to self-organise it for that audience. Robin.
I'll try and organise myself. Very interesting. I've asked you this question already, so I'll ask Alan.
Well, can I hear your answer first?
Which is, if you think back to when we were doing hazards bulletin in the 1980s and 70s, which was surely an early citizen science movement.
Yes, that's right.
It was about industrial democracy. It was about, but it seemed to me that there were two things that were at stake. One was knowing, and the other was mobilising. And those were uneasy bedfellows. And I remember as we taught shop stewards the risks of asbestos exposure and measured it, and that had a certain effect. And actually, if you told people what the actual risks were, they usually stopped being interested. Yeah, because many of these guys, typically guys, were smokers. And when they discovered that it was 10 times more dangerous to smoke than be exposed to asbestos, then they said, I'm smoking, I'm not giving up my smoking. And then Alan Dalton came along and talked about terrible, terrible asbestos. yeah, and promoted and he mobilised both trade unionists and communities to combat asbestos. So
Killer dust, wasn't it? The book Asbestos, Killer Dust.
yes, but the phrase that I remember from the time that people that it was killer asbestos. Yes. So there was a tension between the mobilisation role and the knowing role, and it was one we were constantly navigating between, for example, trying to do measurements that were reproducible and that could be validated against other measurements that factory inspectors might produce, versus telling people that there was a source of pollution needs. So those two things were in tension. It seems to me that one, and it may be that there is some work contrary to. I mean, I agree with nature in that sense. There is some discrimination needed between the different tasks that are underway, and there are different kinds of disciplines that we were constantly managing in that activity. And of course, it seems to me that maybe citizen scientists will often be facing the need to manage between those two roles.
Do you want to say something, Eugénia, on that? Or? Okay, because it's very interesting. I wrote down BBSRC Work Hazards Group in my notes. I just didn't mention it when I was speaking. That's exactly BBSRC is the not BBSRC. BSS, British Society for Social Responsibility for Science, not to be confused with the Biotechnology and Biosciences Research Council. So BISRA is the British Society for Social Responsibility. Science had the Work Hazards Group. But I was going to tell the story very differently from the way you told the story, actually. So it was in my notes to reinforce the argument, and not in this way that you were using it, putting it very polarized. Because the reason I was going to mention it was, precisely, I agree with you, it was a form of citizen science. So here are workers, for example, in the asbestos industry, as Robin says, coming to a group of university-type people. There could be a science shop, or you could see it as citizen science, but it was called the Work Hazards Group, and saying, with this stuff we're working with, could you tell us about it? But my narrative of that would be precisely how, when you talked to a worker, this would be in Rochdale, outside Manchester, and a worker in the asbestos industry, pretty quickly you could kind of recognise what it was, because there were products that you knew quite well. And you could say, well, that's white asbestos, and this is what we know about that. Well, how do we know about that? Well, because experiments are done on this sort of basis. This is what epidemiology is all about. Well, then how does that connect to my... So actually, if it worked well, it didn't always work like that, it would turn into a conversation, which would often end in the conclusion of profound disappointment from the worker in the asbestos industry, that's the only basis on which you know these things. It's on some study of a totally different population, nothing to do that I can see with people like us in Rochdale. And then the question would come, what do I do next? Do I keep my job? Do I leave my job? So rather than trying to separate them, I say, well, that demonstrates, that's my difference, how these two things are completely inseparable. Trying to think through the limited, by definition, nature of our knowledge about these things, and making a decision about your job in a place like Rochdale in the 70s. There weren't too many alternatives. The two things come completely mixed up. The point of the Hazards Group, it was that it allowed, and this is, I guess, the point about citizen science too, a way of keeping that conversation going. It could start off as a relatively simple factual question, which you could answer in just a few words, but it had the potential to kind of make connections between, well, who's actually, common question, who funded the science which led to this conclusion? People would obviously ask that question, and you'd answer it as well you could. And that could lead in all sorts of different directions, including into a national campaign around asbestos. So I guess I wouldn't want to separate them, because I think the point is that if citizen science, if it's got that effect, it's demonstrating the total interconnectedness of these things. That's how I see it.
So we've got Steve.
It's dying to come back.
So, Eugénia, do you want to... Okay, Steve.
Yeah, so citizenship in this discourse seems to be fairly sort of minimal sort of category of participation in civic life. There doesn't seem to be, I haven't got much of a sense that there's any real sort of theorisation of citizenship beyond that. And yet there's a whole
So you historicise that. There's a whole discourse about citizenship that comes in around, in Britain, social democracy at the end of the Second World War, Marshall, and citizenship is about the extension first of political rights and then of civil rights, and one could imagine the extension of epistemic rights, for instance, if you wanted to theorise it in those terms. I've no particular brief for that. What's interesting is the way that Marshallian notion of citizenship sort of became revived in the 1990s as a reaction to the profound neoliberalism and a resurgence of some kind of labour movement, but then was turned on its head in terms of, particularly in the Blair years, in terms of responsibilities. And to be a citizen, you've got to have responsibilities if you're going to have rights as well. There's a whole set of things there that it seems could be mobilised in these debates, but it's simply somehow been watered down to just taking part in, whether it is a face-to-face engagement or just gaming or whatever. There's no exploration of citizenship.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And the work I've been doing when I've started thinking about citizenship as being a crucial notion here that is not being explored. I started to do that sort of travel, traveling in time, and going back to the literature about citizenship and going back to Marshall and all that. And I agree, it's absent. And in a conference like in San Jose, it is about citizens, and it is about, in some discourses, it is about rights, the rights of the citizens. But it is very much, I think, perceived as something that it's, citizens are entitled to, but mediated by mediation of these practitioners or something, or that educate citizens into those notions and make them aware that they are entitled to whatever, a healthy environment and so forth. But it's something that's not very well, I think, integrated into the discourses in terms of political rights or taking the rights further to a new level. I think the movement, if we call this the citizen science movement, the movement lacks still that sort of realization and understanding.
So I come to you next time, but I mean, I guess there's something to be said there about the different take-up of this in different national contexts. I mean, one would expect different notions of what a citizen might routinely expect, or what citizens' relation to power or something. I mean, so, I think a student has an idea about a constitutional moment and so on. The way in which citizenship is constituted through the way in which science is called to account in different systems. So is there anything comparative that you think about here, or any other way you want to respond to Steve?
Well, I mean, one thing looking at Steve is just to say, I mean, you can certainly make the argument that citizen science is nothing new. I mean, this could also be 19th century science. Bird watchers having, profound expertise, as amateur astronomers. I mean, these are not new phenomena. So there is an element of rebranding, so to say, just to make that point. But the second thing is that you don't get many social scientists in these kind of environments. I mean, you, me, Tom Wakeford, and you can pick them out, name by name, really. This is not a place where social sciences particularly seem to be relevant. And actually, if I can say, the nod towards my book was, a sort of, I guess there was something in that idea of science-citizen relations, which Chris Velarde was reacting to, but it wasn't running through the whole thing. So this is more a meeting of people who are enthusiastic about science communication, really. I mean, a lot of it had exactly that feeling. And just like with people who are doing work with kids in school, or people who are into science in the media, there's a real sense of, isn't that just great? Amy was basically talking, the IWire person was basically saying, you know, this is a way of celebrating science, and that was very clear. So that's much more the emphasis on, isn't it just fantastic that science is spreading out? So scientism, the person's gone now, was very close to the mark. With only the merest little kind of admixture of, doesn't that raise some questions? I mean, the things you were raising about the Nature editorial, I didn't hear much discussion even at that level in Citizen Science Association. It was much more celebratory. That, isn't this exciting that we've got to this point? So, you know, and I suppose that's the big question as to whether the citizen bit of citizen science will turn into a larger discussion, or will it become 19th century amateur science, just with a different label.
Okay, so we have Jane and then Newly.
Yes, Doctor.
Jane, and I was going to say, I mean, I guess the environmental justice movement also has a notion of that connection between knowledge making and
Yes,
citizens' rights to know these things.
it does, but I don't think of that connecting with the citizen science movement. I guess that's the point.
Jane, sorry.
Yeah, I suppose I'm quite sceptical about the emancipatory potential of citizen science in the context in which I see it. And so I think kind of challenges to epistemic authority are likely to be resisted, as you pointed out in the nature fracking example. So I wondered what epistemic justice does, because I don't know exactly what you mean by it, but its justice seems to be quite strong, and it also seems to be something that would challenge the epistemic authority of science, maybe. So if you could elaborate on epistemic justice.
But you're right. I mean, the basic skepticism we have is correct, and there were some attempts at the meeting in San Jose to bring that vocabulary, let's call it, that discourse, in amongst citizen science. But I would say it was rather at the periphery. So I suppose the question for me would be, empirically, will citizen science develop in that way? Could it connect with the environmental justice movement, or could it not? That's the empirical question. And the kind of the value-laden question is, could one see ways in which citizen science could be encouraged to pick up these concepts? And I think the challenge there, thinking about it, is as much the sorts of people who are behind this right now, and whether they see it, I mean, being very cynical, it's just a way of doing science, but now you've got access to mass, I mean, a lot of scientists will say this, look at the mass observation potential. We're all, you know, under a lot of pressure financially. If you can tap into that, fantastic. You've got a lot of people with their eyes on the sky, and that's a way of extending what you're doing. Justice is no part of that discussion whatsoever. So I know I'm not saying it's there in the discussion, I'm just simply saying, you know, if you're going to develop a citizenship element, that would be one way of doing that.
Ta-da!
Thank you.
But I'm nervous now.
No. I'm just curious to know if you would apply the concept of science citizenship to climate skeptics. I have the impression from the kind of empirical examples that you're using all the time is that you're referring to groups of people that in some sort of way they always reinforce the consensus in one way or another. And I just wonder whether is that something very clear, or is it just you're just talking about people who expose some sort of scientific reasoning, which I would argue climate skeptics do, to claim for an opening of it as bait, and that's what they're doing. So I don't know, is that something a concept you would use, or?
I mean, that appears to fall foul of the nature
Yes.
criterion as well, doesn't it? You know, they're like those fracking people, but they're the other way around, as it were.
Yes. I mean, it's difficult. I never thought about that. I don't see why not. You know, just from thinking aloud, really.
But the thing about citizen science is the sort of hands-on nature of it, which
Yeah, I
climate
mean,
skeptics may lack.
guess I mean, we could just say on a very defensive kind of way, just say, well, it depends on how they do it, really, because citizen science, well, do they use the same sort of mechanisms and tools and instruments and so on that the, I don't know, Zoomniverse or whatever, other platforms use? Do they mobilize citizens to take part in some way, in some sense? I guess my first sort of reply goes, that's the easier bit, yeah, no, but it's a good point. I don't know.
But it needs that bit. I mean, I guess that's the thing which may be different from our work hazards group discussion that we're having earlier. That there's something about citizen science seems to have that element of knowledge production. Whether that is literally observing the birds in your very small back garden and seeing how they change. It's observation level counts. It's somehow doing science. So climate skeptics would have to somehow at least be able to claim it's based on some kind of observation. Now that's possible too. But hey, we've been studying Edinburgh for the last 10 years and actually it's getting warmer every year. That's because we've been tracking temperatures. Now you're talking about that could
So
certainly be
there's an
described.
element of so in your definition of scientific citizen, there's this element of explicit willingness of
In citizen science.
making knowledge.
Yeah, or some claim to be producing, in some way working with that. Otherwise, it's public participation, but it doesn't seem to have the other. I suppose, I'm not sure that's the best definition in the world, but it seems to me to capture those two things, which is just saying we don't agree with you about climate change. And then stopping doesn't have the same.
James, and then
kind of following that up, we can have this kind of citizen science as a contribution to sort of fundamental research and production of universal knowledge, but I think we also have very much citizens be able to use scientific approaches and tools and methods to develop evidence within a situation in which they want to act as activists, where it may be seen as counter-science. Like you say, you extrapolate from what Robin was saying, one study done somewhere completely different, and you say, well, this applies to you as well. And you can turn around and say, we would like to do our own study using all these techniques and see if it really does apply to us. Because no scientist is going to do that, because it's not, then it's part of this fundamental research, but it's the kind of, let's say, application of science in society, where the citizens say nobody else is doing this, we're concerned about this, and we have the tools to do it. And that is maybe not talked about quite so much in citizen science, but when you look at some of the particular cases, a lot of these projects are about topics that people who live in a place are concerned about, and that's why they do take part, or around topics they're concerned about. So like light pollution, that's sort of one of the latest thing. That is, it's not a fundamental scientific problem, but it is of concern to many people, and you can use these techniques to produce a certain quality of evidence that's going to have an impact. So I don't know, how does these types and places and of citizen science fit into how you think?
But that is, and to be honest, going back 20 years, those are the sort of examples I think in the book I was looking for, whether that was then labelled citizen science or not, but examples, we probably talked then a lot about situated knowledge and contextual knowledge, and the problem with that kind of language, it always implies there's something else which is non-contextual knowledge. Well, we know science is also contextualised. But popular epidemiology was another expression that used to be used quite a bit at the time. All of this, frankly, usually looking for positive examples, but usually making exactly that move, that the generality might say that asbestos workers develop mesothelioma at this rate, but that tells us very little about how things are organised at our particular factory in Rochdale. So somehow we need to, let's do a survey of how many workers in the asbestos industry in this company have developed asbestos, which then has all the problems of lacking scientific legitimation, because that's not really how you do scientific research, etc. But those dynamics often come through when people try to move to their particular environment from the generality of the discussion. Because people, I'm not a standard worker in the asbestos industry, I'm this particular person in this particular context.
Okay, please.
I wanted to ask you a question about control and ownership. Yeah? So it seems like a lot of what passes for citizen science, if you like, the scientists, the official scientists, still have a lot of control over the way the information is presented. So if you look at the Zooniverse or you look at the cancer research thing, looking for cells and so on, actually what you see, you don't really have any control over it. Whereas the open data movement, has a completely different view of that. Because if you look at that and you look, say, at clinical trials, for example, then really should all the data be published? Because quite a lot of it isn't anyway. And a lot of the failed trials are certainly not published. Yeah. So I think do you see a contrast, I suppose, between the ideas around open data as opposed to the ideas around citizen science? And what's the tension that you see around that?
Yeah, but that's another one. I mean, it's hard to have a general answer to that. I mean, making citizen science data open, I mean, you'd have to think very hard about what actually...
But we pay for lots of data that scientists collect. I mean, most of the data is actually funded by UK government. In UK, it's funded by UK government.
Yes, but if a citizen science project is about you and I as neighbours, let's survey the earthworms in our back garden, and that's a classic citizen science, and perhaps someone from whatever department of the university will advise us. It's hard to know how to make that open in the survey.
But the data around, let's say, the astronomy data or the data that Cancer Research UK...
Yes, I understand that.
I mean,
yes.
And in a sense, should be in common ownership, and isn't.
Yes, but I'm not arguing about that.
A lot of citizen science is based on those data sets. It's about making inferences from those data sets in some sense. Much of the buzz around those sorts of things that you see now. I mean, Zooniverse, for example, a whole bunch of stuff around cancer, for example, protein folding. All of those things they're around existing data sets that, in some sense, are the result of publicly funded research, and citizen science is constructed on top of those data sets. Yeah.
But whereas you're
is,
thinking it should go, as it were, all the way through them, rather than just be...
The issue is, I think, that if you look at open data, then what you've got is the potential. If you say that data should be open, then you have a potential for reanalysis, you have a potential for reaggregation, you have a potential for linkage. That okay, you need some kind of governance over it, but potentially it's a much deeper notion of a scientific endeavour in some ways, and also it's much more related to elements that Steve talked about when he was talking about citizenship in some sense, because it has to do with a deeper engagement in some way or another. So.
Yeah.
Okay, Robin claims to have a very small, well, C. I'm interested in this. And then Rob, I think, yeah.
Something very happens when we use the S word, and science invokes our idea of a privileged space. And I think if we use knowledge, we would produce a different mapping of it. But just to come back on...
I knew he was going to do that. I knew it was an S for citizenship.
You were suggesting a separation. You were thinking that I was suggesting separation.
Yes, I heard you like
between
that.
mobilisation and knowing.
Like
and I think something differently, because it seems to me that these are hybrid spaces where different kinds of activities are taking place. And the question is whether what you're doing spirals out towards contributing towards systematic, verified, validated forms of knowing, or towards forms of, in the case of workplace hazards, worker political action. And those are separate spirals. It's a little bit like we made a distinction between domestication and diffusion. And people said, well, but actually, if you look at technologies being introduced, these things are both happening, but in one case, there's a learning process that spirals out to the user of the technology in their practices. Another spirals out to another pathway to how an artifact evolves. And I think we can also see in citizen science two or multiple spiralings out.
Yes.
But as you move towards science, then different kinds of, as you say, every occupational disease was discovered by workers and their unions. Every occupational disease was first discovered by workers and their unions. However, as you try to then demonstrate the nature of those diseases, you need to have formal kinds of epidemiology, which mean that you can't just use union records or anecdotes. So other methods come into play to produce those forms of verified knowledge. So it's not. I think we need a model that can engage with those hybrid spaces, but doesn't conflate them all, and therefore suggest that people who are making a separation are suggesting that they be cast asunder in that old modernist way, which I wasn't suggesting.
No, I stand corrected.
That was supposed to be a small one, Rob.
Yes.
Yes.
That was a good one.
I fell for that again. Okay, right. So we've got two more. We've got Robbie and then Mike. Okay.
So there was a recent news story about a young diabetic guy who couldn't get access to an insulin monitoring machine because the NHS can't afford to provide that certain equipment. So I think he fashioned his own one from, I believe it was a tic-tac box with some rudimentary wiring. And he's began to distribute that to other members of the diabetic community through internet forums and other informal kind of routes like that. And I just wondered, firstly, would you consider that to be citizen science? And secondly, if so, how do you reconcile like the positive aspects of citizen science with in areas that are highly regulated and quite contentious, such as medical science?
But it's very interesting you give that example because in June there was a big event in Brussels with the European Commissioner Carlos Moedas, roughly pronounced, he's Portuguese, and basically there was that very example was given in the discussion, so it's a big deal, and there's a guy called Von Hippel who's written about open innovation. Have I got the right name? Yes. And now he's talking about citizen innovation. So it was very directly linked to the idea of citizen science, but he was saying there's a precise analogy to citizen science called citizen innovation. And the story was slightly different, actually, interestingly, because it was the parents, a child, and the pictures of them, but they developed exactly the same thing, a machine that would dose insulin so people aren't spiking and they don't forget to take it. And of course that was just the sort of thing the European Commissioner thought was fantastic, that now innovation, it's a very close analogy to the argument of science. Whether you call it science or innovation, I don't care. But of course what it does alert you to then, in that bit of the story wasn't really explained, what happens next, is, because you can easily see how something starts off precisely as you said, sharing with other parents or people in the same position. And how then does that story end up? It's a little bit like the Chris Fillardi one. Is there a way of giving over of IP or the equivalent to some inventor who can now patent it out? And how does the story move off? I don't know the answer, but I think it's really interesting to see those sort of parallels. And it fits with the idea of open innovation as well. I think it's very, and you would predict that science and innovation would move together. So perhaps the traditional bird watchers are one model, but it may be what you're talking about now is a totally different model. All I can say is in the conference that was seen in 100% positive terms. There was no element of critique or even questioning about that. It was just seen as a very, very good thing.
Okay, Mike, your question. Kathy, can I ask you to take over the chair because I've got Alison from IT coming over to see me any second.
You have -3 minutes.
Yes.
Because I think
Are you coming back, Steve?
Yes, I just need to check if she's outside my office.
I have a concern with how we're talking about citizen science here, because if it's to democratize science, then shouldn't the intention to democratize sit with the public and I just, you know, with those people who are engaged in it. And from what I'm hearing, it sounds like those actors, those citizens who are involved in these projects, on the whole, do not see themselves as being there to democratise. They're there to learn, to engage, and to produce knowledge. And this is a different term for STS. If that's the case, then we're moving away from speaking bottom up when posing categories on the public. Deficits even.
No, I will just very briefly. I think that's a good point, and I think it fits into with the point that was just raised. And I think essentially it's about the way what we're discussing now is what do we think that citizen science is really, and what I've been trying to work on is really the citizen science that encompasses what that example about the guy who developed his own diabetes whatever equipment, because that fits into it's very closely related with the DIY movement, and that is science that is made, you know, people tinker with equipment in their own houses and whatever, but it's science made by people. Some may be scientists, some may be trained, but some are not. And so whether we really cut the boundary, where do we trace the boundary, I think it's very much up to discussion, and James raised the problem or the issue about citizens that take their own initiative and, you know, a bit like Alan was talking about 20 years ago, citizens that, you know, take their initiative and fight for their own interests and so on, their own cause. So citizen science, from my point of view, the way I think about it and the way I try to conceptualize it, it's much more than that sort of idea that we, I think, the idea that is mainstream in the community, that is, scientists devise programs and initiatives where then citizens participate, are recruited to participate. I think that is a very narrow notion. It is one notion of citizen science, but it's just one model, it's just one possibility. So I think citizen science in the whole, let's say the fulsome notion, is very much connected with democratization of science, with open knowledge as well. There are organizations that really put their databases, the knowledge that is produced, make it open. It's there for to be used. So I think it really depends on the way we conceptualize the movement part.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing for me is we've discussed, particularly kind of discussion with Robin, is about how these categories mix around. That's why I use the oil and water picture, I suppose. That, you know, it seems like in these discussions about citizens, something about what we've discussed, something about citizens, something about knowledge production, something about responsibilities, is somehow being shaken together, and that's the bit that interests me. Rather than, because sometimes people will say, see, there's a definitional question. Many political scientists say, well, let's put the citizenship thing over here and science over there, then ideas of democracy can fit into a model, so to say. Whereas, yeah, precisely the interesting thing is, when one is engaging in citizen science, how do you disentangle the knowledge production part, which you can look at, like in the categorization, from the citizenship dimension, which you can also see going on. But the point is that people are doing all these things without really using that kind of vocabulary at all. I mean, as you won't be surprised to know, people tend to be rather modest, so they don't say, hey, I'm contributing to knowledge production, any more than they say, we're developing a new kind of citizenship. And that's, we're actually talking about worms here. You know, we are, isn't it fascinating that, you know, the worms in your area are different from the worms in my area? Why would that be? Let's, you know, so it's fun because it's very specific and literally hands-on. You're not saying, let's have an exercise in citizenship. So it's the relationship between those two things which I find very interesting.
The worm. Yeah.
The worms
There's
are
going to be
good.
a whole lot of conversation about worms over coffee tomorrow.
The
I
worms
think.
come in and the worms go out. Yeah.
We've had a great day of celebration. We've seen another of our PhD students succeed at their Viva, and we've been so fortunate that we've persuaded Alan to stay on and join us in this afternoon's discussion. I think it's been a very nice format, having two speakers. We normally have one. So thank you very much, Eugénia, for helping to organise it, and James and colleagues for contributing as well, for filming. And we'd particularly like to thank you, Alan, for travelling over the North Sea. I'm looking forward to going to Copenhagen next month.
Excellent.
On a direct flight, which I'm particularly pleased
There
about.
is.
But we will let you escape onto your next engagement, and thank you very much.
Thank you.